From the surface, this looks like just another quiet, wartime harbor. But it is not. Beneath the water lies a World War II ship that authorities deliberately erased from the record. Not because it was fragile, but because admitting what it carried would have been worse. The ship was sunk in a port considered safe. No front line, no warning, and no one was ever allowed to say what was inside its hold. Yet when it went down, the secret didn't stay contained. Something escaped. Something the doctors treating the wounded were never given permission to name. The war ended decades ago. So why was this ship never allowed to officially exist at all? The ship was called SS John Harvey. On paper, it was unremarkable. A standard American Liberty ship, mass-produced, unmarked, one of thousands built to keep Allied supply lines moving during World War II. There were no special warnings painted on its hull, no escort that suggested unusual importance. To anyone watching the harbor traffic, it looked like just another cargo vessel waiting its turn to unload. But in 1943, the war had entered a quieter, more dangerous phase. Allied commanders feared that Nazi Germany, facing defeat, might resort to chemical weapons. Not on the battlefield, but against cities, ports, civilians. The memory of gas warfare from the First World War still lingered in military planning rooms. So a contingency was prepared. Not a declaration, not a deterrent spoken aloud, but a response designed to exist only if it ever had to be used. The United States quietly transported chemical munitions to Europe. They were never acknowledged publicly. Even most Allied officers were not informed. The SS John Harvey was one of the ships selected to carry this cargo. Its orders were absolute. No markings, no manifests that raised questions, and no circumstances under which the cargo was to be discussed. If the ship arrived safely, the secret would remain buried in warehouses and sealed holds. If it did not, then the existence of what it carried would have to be denied. Because acknowledging the cargo would mean admitting that the war had already crossed a line no one wanted to name. When SS John Harvey entered the harbor at Bari, it blended perfectly into the crowd of Allied ships. And that was the most dangerous thing about it. Because if the ship was destroyed, the cargo officially never existed. And everyone involved was expected to act as if that were true. The harbor was never meant to be a battlefield. By late 1943, it had become one of the busiest Allied ports in the Mediterranean. Supply ships lined the docks, unloading fuel, ammunition, food, everything needed to keep the war moving north. There were no trenches here, no hardened defenses, no sense that this place might be tested. The SS John Harvey lay among dozens of other vessels, its silhouette indistinguishable from the rest. No guard perimeter, no special anchorage, nothing to suggest that one ship carried a burden the others did not. This is where the danger truly begins. Not in deep water, not in isolation, but in proximity. From this point on, there was no way to separate the ship from the city around it. The harbor was packed with steel hulls drawn tight together, ships full of men, cargo, fuel, and expectation. A single strike here would not remain contained. Yet no evacuation was ordered. No warnings were issued, because acknowledging risk would have meant acknowledging why one ship mattered more than the others. Above the waterline, everything appeared routine. Dock workers moved between piers. Crews prepared for unloading at first light. That normalcy was the last protection the harbor had. Below the surface, the SS John Harvey waited. Its cargo sat sealed in darkness, surrounded by a city that had no idea it was sharing a harbor with something that was never meant to be exposed. This was not a frontline mistake. It was a calculation, made in peacetime logic and applied to a wartime environment. And when the night sky finally filled with aircraft, the harbor had no defenses prepared for what would happen next, because this was never supposed to be the place where the secret came apart. The attack came at night. German aircraft crossed the Adriatic under cover of darkness, striking the harbor with precision. Fuel ships burned first. Ammunition vessels followed. Explosions rolled across the water, tearing through hulls packed too closely together to escape the blast. SS John Harvey was hit early. Its deck vanished in fire. The ship broke apart before anyone could understand what had been released into the harbor with it. At first, the injuries made no sense. Men pulled from the water showed burns where no flames had touched them. Skin blistered after brief contact with seawater. Eyes swelled shut. Survivors who had escaped the explosions collapsed hours later, gasping for breath, their lungs failing without visible wounds. Doctors worked through the night, overwhelmed by casualties that did not behave like normal combat injuries. They treated burns that would not heal, respiratory damage without shrapnel, blindness with no apparent cause. And still, no one told them what they were dealing with. Medical officers were instructed to record symptoms, but not explanations. Case notes were filed without diagnoses. Deaths were attributed to unknown causes, even as patterns became impossible to ignore. The truth existed only in fragments, never spoken aloud, never written in full. Because to name the weapon would have been to admit that it had been there at all. Among the surviving records is a small, unremarkable artifact. A medical notebook, water-stained, its pages stiff with salt. Inside, a nurse's handwriting lists observations in careful detail. Blistering after minimal exposure, respiratory failure without trauma, symptoms appearing hours after rescue. There is no mention of gas, no reference to weapons, only the quiet accumulation of evidence that something unnatural had entered the harbor. The notebook does not explain what happened. It only confirms that those treating the wounded were fighting an enemy they were never allowed to identify. For years, the incident lived only in sealed files and unfinished medical reports. Families were given incomplete answers. Medical staff were warned not to speak. The ship was gone. The cargo was denied. And the casualties were absorbed into the accepted losses of war. But the secret had already escaped. It lingered in records that refused to align, in symptoms that could not be explained away, in a harbor where the damage could not be fully named, only quietly endured. The moment SS John Harvey broke apart, the silence surrounding it became impossible to contain. And for the first time, the weapon that officially did not exist had left proof behind. When the harbor fires finally died down, the war moved on. New fronts opened, new ships arrived, and the name SS John Harvey quietly disappeared. There was no memorial for what it carried, no official explanation for why so many injuries never made sense. The answers were delayed not because they were unknown, but because they were inconvenient. For decades, the truth lived only inside sealed files, signed, stamped, and forgotten. Medical reports were left unfinished. Witnesses were instructed to remain silent. By the time the story was finally acknowledged, most of the people who had seen it unfold were gone. So were those who had given the orders. This was not a weapon that ended a battle. It did not change the course of the war. It waited, protected by silence, long after the fighting stopped. Some weapons don't end wars when they are used. They end them later, when no one is left to deny they were ever there. Echoes from the deep.